All right, folks, it looks like we might be overwhelming this system with the number of people coming in. We're going to push on because I can see the numbers are still streaming upwards, which is very exciting. And it's wonderful to see such overwhelming interest in hearing from the Minister this evening. But I do want to just apologise in advance for any technical difficulties that we might have. We did move from a Zoom meeting to a Zoom webinar function in order to cater to the amount of interest that we've had for this evening's event. So please bear with us in terms of any technical difficulties that we might have this evening. But given we've got lots of numbers, lots of people already watching, and we are at time, I would love to kick us off. So thank you all very much for joining us tonight for this inaugural National Evening with the Minister. If you would like to access closed captions for this evening, please click the link in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Tonight, the Zoom link originated in Brisbane. Moment to play a short welcome to country. Thank you, Auntie.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. My name is Deborah Sandy, Auntie Deb, daughter of Uncle Des Sandy of Magunchin, Brisbane. And the traditional Aboriginal name we call Brisbane is Magunchin. So I'd like to acknowledge the ancestors. I'm at Megan Bungaree, born right in Brisbane Botanical Gardens. And on South Side, the ancestors, Billin, or Billin. And those two headmen were regional headmen, had children and married, so therefore I have rights on both sides of the river. Now, before I do a customary welcome and that to each and every one of you here, and that, firstly, I got to know all your name and where you all come from. So on the count of three, can you please call out really, really loud where you all come from and what your name is? So 1, 2, 3.
Dave from Brisbane.
Jingawalu Walu, Goodnam, Mugwai. On behalf of the Yagara people of the Great Southeast, Wibolka, welcome. I welcome each and every one of you here today to this sacred place on which we meet and gather. And like the stars of the Southern Cross, which help to guide and unite us, which brought each and every one of us here to this sacred place on which we meet and gather, Wibolka, welcome. Oh, Jinaja, ha Jinaja, ha Jinaja. Nile Mill, oh Nile Mill, oh Nile Mill. Marumba, ha Mugra. Marumba, ha Mugra. Marumba, ha Mugra. Welcome.
Thank you, Auntie Deb, for your welcome. I'm Dave Copeman, and I'm the Director of the Queensland Conservation Council. And on behalf of everyone online, I'd like to gratefully accept Auntie Deb's welcome to this meeting. Now, I'm dialing in from Alexandria Heads on the lands of the Undambi clan of the Cubby Cubby language group. But we have hundreds, hopefully more than 1,000 people from all across Australia joining us online. Now, we asked you when you registered for this webinar to mark on a map where in Australia you're joining from. Unfortunately, the technology has failed us and clumped together. It looks like all of Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne into one number. But as you can see, there are hundreds of people who did this registration. But I actually need your help to demonstrate that people all across Australia care about this and the diverse audience we have. So if everyone now could please introduce yourself in the chat. So if you can write in your name, where you're on, whose country you're on, and the organisation or the issue that brings you here tonight. So I can see people are putting those in. We've got more than 1,000 people online and all over. Wow, they're flying through there really quickly. So it's important for us to demonstrate that it's not just the inner cities of the big cities where people care about nature. I know in my home state of Queensland, all across the state, people love getting out in nature and they love caring for the incredible biodiversity that we are so lucky to live with. So this is why we're gathered here today, because we all care about this and we're really grateful for the chance to demonstrate this to our Minister, Minister Plibersek. So over to you, Jackie.
Thanks, Dave. I'm Jackie Mumford. I'm the CEO of the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales. And I'm joined tonight by Bronya Lipsky, the Policy and Advocacy Manager from Environment Victoria, and we will be your MCs this evening. Tonight, we're very pleased to host the Minister for the Environment, Tanya Plibersek, on behalf of the environment and conservation movement around the country. This event is hosted by the Conservation Councils. Each state and territory has a Conservation Council, a member-based, non-government organisation who exists to represent nature and to give it a voice. We are the bridge between the grassroots environment movement and government. The Conservation Councils have a long history of winning outcomes for nature, whether it's adding to the National Parks estate, improving management of biodiversity, our precious rivers and wetlands, or stopping destructive developments. We work to make sure civil society has a voice in representing nature. And we're at a critical time for environmental management in Australia. The Minister has started the process of reforming how we manage the impacts of industry and development on the environment right across the country. And tonight is about presenting the key issues where reform is desperately needed. So we will hear from folks all around the country who are working on these issues firsthand and people who have lived experience of environmental destruction. We'll then ask the Minister questions related to the experiences of these folks. So if you have questions or commentary as we go, please use the chat function. And we will make an effort to stay to time, and there will be a reminder for our speakers to wrap up if you are going over time at all. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Minister. Tanya Plibersek is the Minister for the Environment and Water. Minister Plibersek, and Minister, I'll just read some of your wonderful accolades before I hand over to you. Minister Plibersek entered federal parliament as the member for Sydney in 1998, and between December 2007 and September 2013, she served as Minister for the Status of Women, Minister for Housing, Minister for Social Inclusion, Minister for Human Services, and Minister for Health and Medical Research. She served as Deputy Leader of the Opposition and Deputy Leader of the Labor Party from 2013 to 2019. Tanya is passionate about protecting and preserving Australia's natural environments for future generations. Thank you, Minister.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Jackie, for that introduction, and thank you, Dave, as well for earlier. And I want to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present of our Sydney peoples, but also I know we've got people joining from all over Australia, and I'm sure that everybody would want to join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that they're on. And for any First Nations people that we have with us tonight, I pay my respects to you also. I want to thank the Queensland Conservation Council for suggesting and hosting this event. I think it's a really great opportunity for us to talk in a very direct way about what the government's planning to do for the environment and some of our thinking about legislative reform and the sort of things that we need to do to better protect more of what's precious, to restore more of what's been damaged and manage nature better for the future. We've got a really big legislative agenda. You would have seen some of the things that we've done in the last couple of weeks. For example, we tripled the size of Macquarie Island Marine National Park and added an area the size of Germany to the highly protected waters around Macquarie Island. We've worked out how to phase out gillnet fishing on the Great Barrier Reef. That's just, a couple of things that we did last week. And we also, in the Parliament, introduced the Nature Repair Bill, which has now passed through the House of Representatives and is off to a Senate inquiry. Probably the biggest thing that we've got, well, there's really two things, I guess, that are keeping me very busy prospectively, and that's the reforms that we're doing to the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, and of course, delivering on the Murray-Darling Basin plan, delivering the plan in full. The Murray-Darling Basin plan is just so difficult because for the last 10 years, there's been virtually no progress. About 80% of the water that's been returned for the environment under the Murray-Darling Basin plan was done when we were last in government. And in fact, when it comes to the 450 gigalitres of additional environmental water that is the feature of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, I inherited a situation where only 2 gigalitres of that 450 gigalitres had been found for the environment. So we've got a long way to go on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. But one of the things that will have the biggest long-term impact are the changes that we're proposing to Australia's environmental laws. So I think most people know a bit of the history of this. The EPBC Act's been around since 1999. In 2020, Professor Graham Samuel did its usual statutory review, and he found that the EPBC Act wasn't protecting the environment, and also it was slow and cumbersome for proponents of projects as well. We're working with environmental groups and the business community to try and take the broadly supported agreements around Professor Graham Samuel's recommendations from, you know, a pretty high level set of agreements to very detailed legislation, and also draft new national environmental standards that would underpin the legislation. It is big, it's complex, it's difficult work. A number of the organisations that have brought you together tonight have been engaged in that work, and I suppose the timeline for it is that we'll be releasing draft legislation and draft national environmental standards towards the end of this year, with the expectation of a very good and thorough period for consultation, and then legislation introduced to the Parliament next year. I really think this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get our environmental laws right. We've been presiding over the slow destruction of nature, and we can't do that anymore. We want to flip our laws so that they are nature positive. So we'll do things like have an offset standard, which will regulate the offsets hierarchy, so we avoid destruction wherever we can. We mitigate where we can't avoid completely. Offsets as a last resort. One of the things we're changing is that nature will have to be better off overall. If there is any use of offsets, we're going to have to more than compensate for damage. And I think that actually codifying this and making sure that we are switching from just presiding over the slow destruction of nature to a nature positive environment is going to be really significant in the long run. Just a super quick thing I wanted to mention as well is the law reform that we're doing is obviously a really cornerstone set of reforms for nature, but it's not the only thing we're doing. So we've got our Threatened Species Action Plan, of course, where we've committed to 0 new extinctions, and the $224.5 million we committed to that in the October budget. We've got our agreement to the biodiversity measures that were agreed in Montreal. And so we've got a target of 30 by 30, 30% of our land and 30% of our oceans protected by 2030, and restoration and the other things that are reflected in that protocol. And of course, we're working on, you know, other big areas like reducing waste, you know, designing out plastics, unnecessary plastics and single-use plastics and so on. So it is a pretty massive reform agenda, but I know that you've got some things that you want to tell me and ask me about. So back to you.
Lovely, thank you. Thanks so much for that overview of all the important work that you're doing. And as you say, yes, there are a few key issues that we would like to ask you about tonight. So the issues that we've identified as the conservation movement and environment movement for you to address this evening, Minister, EPBC reform, which you mentioned, how the National Environmental Law will assess the impacts of projects on driving climate change, deforestation, and management of the Murray-Darling Basin. And to present on each of these areas and to ask questions, we're joined by Dave Copeman from the Queensland Conservation Council on EPBC reform. On the climate trigger, we have Maggie Wood from Conservation Council Western Australia. On deforestation, I will speak on behalf of Nature Conservation Council. And on Murray-Darling Basin reform, we'll hear from Craig Wilkins at Conservation Council South Australia. So to get stuck into it, to get straight to our first issue, I'd like to hand over to Dave Copeman, Director of the Queensland Conservation Council. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Jackie. Minister, as you acknowledged, as Graham Samuel said, our federal environmental laws are broken. And many of the people on this call are those at the front line seeing the impact of the fact that they're failing to protect extinctions, they're not protecting the places we love, and time again, they're allowing the approval of disastrous projects in areas that really should never have been considered for them. And you've acknowledged this, and thank you for your commitment to reform the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act and to implement the Samuels Review in full. Now, we welcome your pledge to end extinctions and to reform our laws, but it's going to be hard because as we speak, things are getting worse. Now, obviously, the actions at Montreal on the 15th Conference of the Parties for the Convention on Biodiversity were really important. The critical advocacy that the Australian government and you led to ensure the passage of the Global Biodiversity Framework and that 30 by 30 target was welcome. And all of these commitments are welcome. And while it's refreshing to have an environment minister that is determined to make commitments to protect the environment, we still have the broken laws at this stage. We're still seeing increased risk to threatened species, and project after project to continue being assessed under these inadequate laws. Now, there's many examples, but we just thought we'd give one from my neck of the woods in Queensland, and I'll hand over to Andrew Hunter from BirdLife Australia just to talk about it.
Great, thank you so much, Dave, and thank you, Minister, for your time this evening. BirdLife Australia has been campaigning alongside conservation and community groups to protect the environmental values of Moreton Bay from inappropriate development. Specifically at Toondah Harbour, where Walker Corporation seeks to construct a 3,600 unit high-rise apartment complex that will destroy internationally important Ramsar listed wetlands. A project of this scale has never been approved in a Ramsar wetland. Approval would set an unacceptable precedent, risking the sanctity of one of the world's oldest conservation treaties for the gains of a private company. Toondah's wetlands provide feeding and roosting habitat for threatened migratory birds. This includes the critically endangered eastern curlew, one of the 22 birds your department has prioritized for conservation under the latest Threatened Species Action Plan. The proposal is currently being assessed under the EPBC Act, and over 25,000 people have made submissions opposing the project. In a world with better national nature laws, Walker Corporation's proposal would have been rejected at the outset. Minister, we urge you to reject this clearly unacceptable proposal. Thank you.
I'm off mute. And obviously, Minister, we know the EIS is current, so we're not going to get comments from you on Toondah tonight, but this shouldn't be taking this much time. So I guess my question for you is, when are we going to see the action? You mentioned it'll be consultation later this year and action early next year. Can you talk us a bit more through the timeframe of when we will see the reforms to these laws?
Thanks very much, Dave. I actually can't talk to you about Toondah Harbour specifically because I am the decision maker in that matter, and anything that suggests that I have prejudged means that any decision I make can be challenged in the courts. So I know that you appreciate that. So I'm just explaining to people who don't follow this quite as closely why I'm not going to talk specifically about Toondah Harbour. But on the EPBC reforms, this is a huge piece of work. And the reason that it's taking a while is because essentially we've started with a blank sheet of paper. There were recommendations made by Graham Samuel in 2020. The previous government did nothing to advance those. One of the first things we did is put out our nature positive plan. And in fact, I think we launched it with you, Dave, in Queensland. You hosted the launch of the nature positive plan. So for people who want to see the thinking behind the legislative drafting that we're doing at the moment, you can look at that nature positive plan that's available online. But what it shows is that instead of allowing the continual decline that we've experienced over many decades, we need to arrest the decline and turn things around and become nature positive. So I've been looking at the comments a little bit as we've been going, and there's a couple of people who've said, for example, you can't have offsets, or we shouldn't have offsets at all. One of the difficulties that we face as a country is we've got some really big development challenges. Like, for example, we want to get from 30% renewable energy to 82% renewable energy essentially in 82 months. That means we're building solar farms, we're building wind farms, we're building offshore wind, we're building transmission lines, we need critical minerals like lithium and so on. And so the approach we have to take is to avoid damage in the first place. There are some places that will never be developed because they're too precious to develop. The next step is to say, okay, there will be impacts from this development, but we're minimising impacts as much as possible. The idea that you shouldn't compensate for any impacts through using offsets is actually, I think it's a mistake for people to say that we can't actually do much better than we have been and actually add to, repair damaged land and actually provide a nature positive outcome with offsets. And that's why that's going to be one of the first national standards, national environmental standards that we go out and consult on. I know that offsets have been inappropriately used in the past. I know that quite often companies have committed to offsets and not delivered them. There are some areas that you absolutely can't offset because they're so precious that there is no possible offset for them. All of that is true. But if we're going to have new solar farms, new wind farms, new rail projects, new housing developments, we also have to not just protect the areas that are precious, but actually restore some places that are already damaged to add to the total amount of good quality, well-protected environment and habitat that we have. Yeah. So it's going to be very tough to design that right. And that's why we're leaving plenty of time for consultation on that.
No, thank you. And Minister, I think one of the things was people don't have a lot of confidence in offsets because we've seen them be used so badly to justify projects that shouldn't have happened. And I think
I agree with that.
One of the things is, and one of the things is this idea of regional planning, so that we actually have a sense of the cumulative impact, so that instead of saying, okay, this is going to happen, it's going to get offset, there's a sense, okay, how are we judging all that, particularly when it comes to renewables? I know there's a lot of concern around the cumulative impact of all this. So I wondered.
Yes, I can tell you something about that. So first of all, I've doubled the approval rate for renewable energy projects, and I'm proud of that. That's going to be really good for our environment long term, because we have to deal with climate change, right? We have to have renewable energy projects. But what we're doing with both the New South Wales government and the Queensland government is looking for renewable energy zones that make sense. So if you're looking at, like, if you want to build a solar farm or a wind farm, you shouldn't be building it you shouldn't be bulldozing trees to build solar farms. We've got degraded farmland, and we've got farmers who, if they're properly compensated for it, are happy to host projects on their properties. And quite often these projects work very well on agricultural land. Like, there are more sensible places to build these projects. If they are near existing transition lines, if they are around or replacing previous, like, coal-fired power stations, for example, the infrastructure is already there. The roads are there, and very importantly, the transmission lines that get the electricity into people's homes and businesses are already there. So we're focusing on regions where this works better, and then within that region, we're protecting the high-value land. Just on the EPBC reforms, it's not just the law reforms that matter. We're setting up Environment Protection Australia, so more of the decision making will be independent and arm's length from government, and the decisions will be based on information collected by Environment Information Australia. So we're taking all of the bits of data that we've got from previous EISs, from the Threatened Species Commissioner, from scientific studies, from previous proponents doing their own research, bringing that together to do heat maps of places to avoid, places where it's easier to do a project because, for example, there's existing projects that are very similar in the same location. And then in between, you can develop here if you meet these standards, if you avoid damage, if you mitigate, if you offset, if you follow the rules. So regional planning is going to be a big part of minimising the impact.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. And that's our time for EPBC, but we appreciate it. Back to you, Jackie.
Thanks, Dave, and thank you, Minister. And I've also been following the chat, and one thing that's come up there is around a climate trigger and the EPBC Act. So I'll pass now to Maggie Wood, Programs Director from Conservation Council, Western Australia. Thanks, Maggie.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening. I'm coming to you from Yingara country in the Gascoyne region of Western Australia. In recent years, the links between climate change and the environment have become increasingly real for frontline communities all across Australia. What's become really clear is that we need stronger nature laws to ensure that our environment and the places we love are protected from the worsening effects of climate change. Right now in WA, we're seeing a significant expansion of fossil fuel projects, including Woodside's North West Shelf gas production facility and the large Browse and Scarborough gas fields off the West Australian coast, as well as significant gas expansion planned off the coast of the Northern Territory. Despite best efforts across Australia to decarbonise, both Western Australia and the Northern Territory's emissions have increased, and that's almost entirely due to the expansion of the gas industry. As you'll hear from the video testimony shortly, now more than ever, emissions and the associated global warming impacts from fossil fuel projects are having a really significant impact on matters of national environmental significance. Our natural environment must be protected from our growing emissions crisis and climate change. We want to see the EPBC Act strengthened and to have the power to deem projects unacceptable on climate grounds. We'll now play a quick video from Bill Hare from Climate Analytics describing the science of why fossil fuel should be a matter of national environmental significance.
I'm Bill Hare. I'm a senior scientist and CEO of Climate Analytics. Now, I'm very worried about what's happening in Australia on fossil gas development. Fossil gas development is happening at a scale that is globally relevant and will undermine the ability of the world to meet the Paris Agreement limit. A lot of the big projects going on are now household names like Beetaloo in the Northern Territory, fracking of the Kimberley, Woodside's Burrup Hub and Scarborough project, which, by the way, would emit 6 billion tonnes of greenhouse gases over the next decades, nearly 2% of the world's carbon budget. Now, these projects are not needed. We know from the International Energy Agency that we need to be reducing emissions by about 30% by 2030, and we don't need any new fossil gas resources. So there's absolutely no scientific case for continuing to develop gas in Australia. In Australia, as we know, we're already experiencing really severe impacts. We know oncoming are really unlivable conditions in Northern Australia, Kimberley, Northern Territory, unless we can get emissions down. Now, what's really worrying me as well about the future of our country is that we have a massive opportunity to turn our country into a renewable energy superpower, provide the things the world needs sustainably and in a green way. But fossil gas is getting in the way of that. I really see that the massive gas developments being promoted by government and industry risk obstructing that pathway to a renewable future. And that's one of my main concerns. If we don't succeed in Australia in getting greenhouse gases down to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, then we are really going to be creating a major disaster for our economy, our environment, and our people in the future.
Minister, I'm sure if you've been looking in the chat, you'll see people are really engaged on the issue of climate and the EPBC and wanting to hear a lot from you about that. So I guess I'm hoping to start just with a question, given the context of the EPBC reform, whether you could tell us a little bit about how you think greenhouse gas emissions and the impact on Australian nature should be assessed as part of the EPBC process.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Bill, as well, for those comments. we're committed to net zero by 2050. We're committed to a 43% emissions reduction by 2030. We're committed to 82% renewable energy by 2030. That is a huge effort to change Australia to meet those targets. In the last budget, we put $2 billion into green hydrogen, $1.6 billion into home and business electrification. We've got the electric vehicle strategy. We changed ozone laws. We've signed the methane pledge. But the most important thing that we are doing to get to net zero is the introduction of the safeguard mechanism, so that all large projects will be assessed on their carbon dioxide and equivalent gas emissions, and will have to show how they fit in to Australia's trajectory to net zero. That's where the climate impact of those projects is assessed. The Climate Change Minister, Chris Bowen, assesses the climate change impact of projects. As the Environment Minister, I assess the environment impacts of those projects. That's not to say for a second that we're not taking climate change seriously as an environmental risk. Obviously we are, and that's why so much of the work that we're doing is to try and make sure Australia does become that renewable energy superpower that Bill Hare just talked about, but also that we are reducing the impacts of climate change wherever we possibly can be, including in really important places like the Great Barrier Reef, which are at the pointy end, Kakadu National Park, which are at the pointy end of feeling the impacts of climate change that we've already experienced as a nation.
I think you can see again from the chat, sorry, my screen's popped up with lots and lots of people responding to you there. And I think, and sorry to just pointedly ask the question, but I think lots of people really want to understand, you've got the EPBC Act and the safeguard mechanism and where fossil fuel projects as part of that environmental assessment process sit. Are you able to really clarify for people on the webinar tonight your sort of view and how the department will be moving through this assessment process when large fossil fuel projects are proposed by proponents?
Yeah, well, as Environment Minister, I require large projects to disclose their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but it's the Climate Change Minister that regulates through the safeguard mechanism whether those projects fit within Australia's trajectory to net zero. And I'm kind of watching the comments as well. They're moving very quickly, but I am the first Australian Environment Minister in history to reject a coal project. I've cancelled 2 others. I'm not afraid to do it, but it's not the environmental law predominantly that regulates whether and how we get to net zero emissions by 2050 and a 43% reduction by 2030. That is the safeguard mechanism and the laws associated with that.
Thank you for that. I think we're at time for the questions on the climate trigger, so I'll pass over to Jackie.
Thanks, Maggie, and thank you, Minister. I think we're going to hear from Bronya now.
Hi, yes, you are. Thank you, Maggie and Minister Plibersek, and good evening to you all. I am coming to you from the unceded lands of the Bunurong people in Naarm, otherwise known as Melbourne. We are now going to turn our attention to deforestation and native vegetation clearing, noting that Western Australia and Victoria have dates to end native logging, and in fact, Victoria just brought our date forward by 6 years. Australia still has a very long way to go to protect our forest ecosystems and the incredible biodiversity they contain, including global icons such as the Guldian finch, koalas, greater gliders, and a particular obsession of mine, the ghost bat, who haunts bespoke rookeries in the savanna woodlands of Western Australia, the Northern Territory, and Queensland, and which are disappearing at a shocking rate. Jackie is going to join us again for a discussion about deforestation and land clearing. Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks, Bronya. Yeah, land clearing and logging threaten habitat all across Australia, and we have the record for mammalian extinction. And Australia is a global deforestation hotspot. In fact, the only developed nation on that list. Land clearing and logging destroys millennia of work and culture by Indigenous custodians and threatens sacred sites and connection to country. Clearing of critical habitat is continuing unabated across the country, wiping out critical species habitat in state forests and on private land, even in areas that were severely damaged during the 2019-2020 bushfire season. This environmental destruction is currently exempt from the EPBC Act, and the Samuels Review, which has been mentioned this evening, urgently recommended that this be immediately changed. We know that action can't wait until new laws are in place. So tonight we're going to hear first from Susan Lawrence and Cheyenne Hogan, two Aboriginal women living on Yolngu country, who will tell some stories about what country means to them in the Northern Territory, raising awareness of the damage done by land clearing across the territory.
At my grandmother's country, I saw lots of trees knocked down, even baobab trees, right up to the river. My mum and auntie were really angry. It's not right.
I see rangers in my community working so hard to care for country, to protect our land. It makes me angry that other people just want to bulldoze it all down. It's not fair for traditional owners. It's not fair for the people who care for that country.
Thank you to Susan and Cheyenne for that video. We're now going to go to Takisa Frank for our second testimonial. Takisa is a young Aboriginal woman living on Yuin country on the south coast of New South Wales. Thank you, Takisa. And Takisa, you're just on mute at the moment. Can you hear us okay, Takisa? Okay. I think Takisa might be having technical difficulties. Hopefully she can jump in at some point. But Takisa has a story from the South Coast in an area that was affected by bushfire and is now seeing the destruction of native forest logging. Hopefully we can hear her story. But there's similar stories between Susan and Cheyenne and Takisa are just some of the countless communities campaigning to protect our precious places from deforestation. Whether it's from logging or land clearing, what drives these communities to act is a long list, from First Nations culture, protecting biodiversity, carbon storage, even having just fresh air to breathe and clean water to drink. Despite this, we're currently a global deforestation hotspot, and you've pledged to turn this around and aim for zero extinctions. In order to get there, how will you act on deforestation, whether it's native forest logging or land clearing? And will your pledge for regional forest agreements to come under new environmental standards result in an end to native forest logging? Oh, and it looks like Takisa's back. Takisa, if you can come off mute. Thank you. And
hi, everyone. Sorry, I live very remote, so my internet sometimes does this. Walluani, firstly, I would like to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from Yuin country and acknowledge my elders who have been caring for country since the first sunrise. I'm a proud Aboriginal woman. I have a degree in geography focusing on our environment and live on the south coast of New South Wales. I am passionate about seeing an end to public native forest logging across New South Wales and the whole of the country. The habitat of many critically endangered and threatened species are in state forest all over New South Wales, including South Coast State Forest. These species include the greater gliders, swift parrots, gang cockatoos, and large forest owls. By continuing to log these areas and remove hollow-bearing trees, we are increasing the chance of more species becoming endangered and potentially extinct. I have lived my entire life surrounded by state forest. In 2019, I sat in front of my house and watched as the forest burnt around me. Since then, I've sat in the same spot and watched tree after tree come crashing to the ground. The difference between these two occasions is one can be stopped by decision from our state and federal government. And I would like you guys to take a look at the photo in the background. This is a forest that is going to be logged next year. In the middle, you can see a really large tree. That large tree is Big Spotty and is the largest known spotted gum in the world, being 72 meters tall. This forest is going to be logged in 2024 if we don't do something about it. People across New South Wales want to see an end to public native forest logging and protection of our biodiversity. This was proved by the petition that was tabled in 2022 in New South Wales Parliament that had over 21,000 signatures asking the New South Wales government to transition to a plantation industry. We in New South Wales are behind other states who have already started the process of transitioning out of this industry. We've recently seen the Victoria government will end public native logging in 2024. Here in New South Wales, we don't have an end date. As the politicians sitting in Sydney and Canberra see the current industry as sustainable, I urge all politicians to leave their offices and come visit the forest here on the South Coast and see how wonderful they can be when they aren't being logged for firewood or wood chips. We're currently in a climate and biodiversity crisis, and we need to take actions such as ending public native forest logging across Australia to protect our ancient forest and critical habitat for our endangered species. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Takisa, and a lot of supportive comments coming through there in the chat, and so much love for our native forests across the country. I did already put the question to the Minister, but just to quickly refresh that, how will you act to end deforestation, whether it's native forest logging or land clearing? And will your pledge for regional forest agreements to come under new national environment standards result in an end to native forest logging?
Thanks, Jackie, and thanks to Susan and Cheyenne as well as Takisa. Yes, native regional forest agreements will come under the National Environment Standards that will be part of our Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act reforms. So they'll come under those new laws for the first time really since they were set up. That's a very important change. About 90% of our timber comes from plantations already, and we want to see more of that. That's why we're investing $300 million in planting more plantations, making it easier to invest, to expand plantations, and also upgrading the sort of sophistication of, a lot of the timber that's been cut down in recent decades has been used for very low value products, as Takisa was saying, for wood chips and so on. As well as regional forest agreements, though, we've got other problems with deforestation and land clearing, and a bunch of it is obviously related to state laws. So we need to work with state governments to change land clearing laws in their states and territories, and sometimes this stuff's happening illegally, and it's really important to have an environment protection agency like the one we're setting up actually to be a tough cop on the beat to make sure that illegal land clearing isn't happening and isn't being got away with. So much of the land clearing and deforestation that happens never comes near federal environment laws. Federal environment laws don't cover most of the decisions that end up in land clearing, even the legal decisions. And so this is really something that we have to work better with the states and territories on. Can I say, as well as the changes to regional forest agreements being brought under the National Environment Standards, as well as dealing with legal and illegal land clearing issues, we have to also be looking for opportunities of restoring degraded land. And there's, some fantastic organisations that are doing that. I think we saw someone, I just saw Land Care pop up a minute ago just then. Landcare, Australian Land Conservation Alliance, there's a bunch of organisations doing fantastic work. We need to better support that as governments. So we're doing some of that through the National Heritage Trust funding, but we also, I also want to see additional money going in through private and philanthropic investment. And that is the whole purpose of the nature repair market that I know is controversial with some people. But if we say, like, this government has spent more on the environment than any government in Australian history, right? Never has there been more spending on the environment. It is just barely touching the sides of what we need to do. Yeah. And I think turning our backs on the opportunity of seeing additional private and philanthropic investment that is regulated, that is transparent, that is searchable on a public register, that where people can be held to account for actually delivering what they've promised to deliver. I want to see that happen as well. Yeah. So just putting that out there.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a huge issue, but we do still have another issue that we need to get to tonight, which is the Murray-Darling Basin, a critical one, I know, for a lot of the Conservation Council supporters who are tuning in tonight. So we've got a video just on that issue that we'd like to share, and then I'll hand straight to Craig from Conservation Council South Australia.
Stretching from Queensland to South Australia with hundreds of interconnected rivers and streams, the Murray-Darling Basin is home to Australia's most iconic fish and water birds. It's a living landscape that First Nations have cared for over tens of thousands of years. But the rivers of the basin are sick and dying, with dry riverbeds, toxic algal blooms, and massive fish kills that should not have happened. Too much water is being taken from the river system by mega agriculture. It's making the droughts worse and depriving wetlands, wildlife and communities of the water they need to thrive. After the Millennium Drought, the Basin Plan was a step to set things right, keeping enough water for the river, letting it flow, making it fair for all of us. But right from the start, powerful corporate interests lobbied for a weaker plan to keep more water for themselves. Bit by bit, spineless governments buckled under the pressure, and once again, the river was left high and dry. But it's not too late to save the Murray-Darling. We need to join together and demand action. First, the federal government must return enough water to the river, buying it from the many irrigators who want to sell part of their share. Second, we need to let that water flow. We need to change outdated rules to make sure water reaches the wetlands that need it most. And finally, we need to make water management fair, starting by returning water to the traditional owners who've cared for river country for thousands of years. The river needs enough water not just to keep it flowing, but to dance across the floodplain, to flow through to the wetlands, forests, fish, birds and people that need it, and to be free to be a river. We all have a right to water and an obligation to care for the river and each other, upstream and downstream. We can have a living river and communities that thrive in partnership with it. We need to answer a simple question. Is the Murray-Darling a source of life? Or is it something to exploit to the benefit of a select few? If you're not sure, just go to the river and listen.
Thank you. Ninamani, everybody. I'm speaking from unceded Kaurna country on the Adelaide Plains. This video was prepared by Environment Victoria and is one of the first outputs of the Murray-Darling Conservation Alliance, an exciting new Conservation Council-led conservation advocacy voice, which has been created at a critical time for Australia's greatest river system. We thank you, Minister, for your strong advocacy on the Murray-Darling since you came into office, and the positive shift you have created through your commitment to uphold the letter and the spirit of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. It's been long overdue, and we are really looking forward to practical changes in policy and approach starting with the next MINCO meeting of Murray Darling ministers, which I think is coming up in the next month or so. So our question tonight, main one tonight, is to give a sense of how you intend to deliver the full Murray-Darling Basin Plan by the 2024 reconciliation date, and in particular, how you intend to fulfil the commitment to deliver on the final 450 gigalitres of water for the environment.
Thanks, Craig. That was a beautiful presentation as well. The Murray-Darling Basin Plan, we are 100% committed to delivering on the whole of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. But as I said, almost from day one of taking this job, doing it by 2024 is going to be virtually impossible. And the reason is nothing has been done over the last 10 years. 80% of the water that's been recovered towards the plan was done when we were last in government. In fact, more than 80%, about 16% of it, I think, has been done under this government, the previous Liberal National government. So, for example, of that 450 gigalitres of additional environmental water that you're talking about, 2 gigalitres out of 450 was achieved in the 10 years of the coalition government, 2 out of 450. Like, we are so far off meeting these targets that it is almost beyond belief. A bunch of the infrastructure kind of projects, like the projects around Menindee Lakes that were supposed to return water to the environment, were massively overstated as potential contributions to water recovery. Many of those projects are years late. Some of them have been abandoned entirely. The Victorian government just recently paused a number of the projects they're doing, for example. On the issue of returning water to the floodplains, there's a lot of resistance from a number of the state governments about the sort of projects that ease constraints on the flow of the river. So we're in some very tough negotiations there. I am out buying water. There's a question about why don't we just go and buy water. We're doing that. We're in the market right now for 49 gigalitres of water. And we've had a number of approaches from people who are, as I think Craig said, willing sellers. And we will be buying water. There's no question that that will be part of meeting the objectives of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. But we're a long way from meeting it. I think we're currently about 750 gigalitres short of meeting the objectives of the plan, and that is it's a lot of water. It's a lot of water, and we have to do it. I mean, there's no question that we must do this for the health of the river system. And the last couple of years where we've had a bit of rain and we've actually had these massive bird breeding and fish breeding events just show that with a bit of water, the river system can be brought back to health. We used the environmental water even after the floods to keep those floodplains safe for the birds and the fish that were breeding, to keep the pigs and the foxes and so on out of the floodplains, to allow the breeding cycles to continue. We used the water to flush out the low oxygenated black water that was responsible for some of the fish deaths. So environmental water is making a difference every day in the management of the river system, but we are a long way from meeting the objectives of the plan.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I totally support your comment around the environmental water. We're seeing it here in South Australia, definitely. It's fascinating on the chat. It's just coming up continuously about be bold, be bold, be bold. I think there is such a desire after the 10 years of inaction, as you've said, for there to be real action throughout the whole of the Murray-Darling Basin. So when will you announce your preferred process? If you say it's impossible to get there by 2024, when will we know what's going to happen?
We're working very closely with the state and territory ministers now. You'd be unsurprised to know, Craig, that not every state and territory is as enthusiastic about meeting the objectives of the plan as I am. There's a little bit of resistance in some quarters. I'm having that discussion with water ministers literally as we speak. You know, we're in the midst of negotiations now about how we're going to meet the objectives of the plan. I'm pushing them, making it very clear that it's our determination as a Commonwealth government to return all of this water. And I have to say, once that's done, that's not where the work stops, because this will be looking after this river system, this million square kilometres of river system, is going to continue to be a challenge. Southeast Australia is getting hotter and drier. The weather is getting more extreme. We're going to need to keep returning water to the environment, looking after the rivers, the floodplains, the wetlands, making sure, you're from South Australia, making sure the Murray Mouth actually opens to the sea and flushes out some of that salt. We're going to need to keep doing that. It's going to get harder, not easier.
Thank you, Minister. Lots more I'd love to ask you about. We're going to keep moving, but all power to you, especially in these negotiations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Craig and Minister Plibersek. So behind the scenes here, there's been a lot going on. So many of you here this evening have sent us through questions and have been very, very active in the chat whilst Minister Plibersek has responded to the testimonials and the questions that we've put to her. What I would like to do now is to get a sense of what you've all been thinking and your response to the Minister's replies and how you're generally feeling. Can you all please take a moment to select an emoji, which you can see down the bottom of your screen, and select an emoji either in reactions or perhaps put something in the chat that best reflects your impressions of this evening. Choose a heart if you have loved what you've been hearing, clapping hands if you think there is a lot more to be done, and an open mouth for not being happy. And whilst you're putting in your impressions and they're coming through, it looks amazing. Some of the things that we've seen in the chat, I'm going to recap this evening. We've been working very hard to try to collect as much of this as we can behind the scenes. There's lots of folks really concerned about a range of species around the country, from koalas and finches to kangaroos and migratory birds, dingoes as a protected apex predator. And I, for one, am a huge fan of the incredible results for the environment when those apex predators are returned and we get to see a trophic cascade. Lots and lots of folks really concerned about biodiversity offsets around the setting of national environmental standards and wondering if there's a way that we can start with setting some of the environmental standards first. Of course, literally hundreds of questions and comments regarding new coal and gas projects being approved and people's concerned about that and those approvals being done regardless of or despite the urgency around the need to stop such projects, and a lot of comments around the science that supports those types of those claims around climate. Lots and lots and lots of concerns about gas projects. So many people concerned about a whole range of gas fields being opened up, particularly in those places like the Northern Territory and the Beetaloo and what's going on there. Certainly a lot of people concerned about native forest logging and protecting grasslands and wetlands. Loads of concern that we saw around the Murray-Darling Basin, but other river systems as well, not just our Murray-Darling. What can be done about protecting our river systems throughout the country and maybe putting some national attention on some of the water authorities who might be doing some adverse things around the country. And then because we are here nationally and there's a lot of stuff, a lot of really localized issues that people are concerned about. So many invitations, Minister, to people's areas to experience firsthand the environments that people have there, the concerns that they have in those environments. Lots and lots of concerns around waste and plastics and national recycling programs. So much around the country that people are concerned about, which I imagine is very overwhelming for everybody involved, including everybody that works behind the scenes in the department. But lots of hope also. A lot of hope placed on the Minister and a lot of hope invested in you, Minister Plibersek. A lot of comments about the failures of previous governments and a lot of hope that this change in federal government is really going to bring the changes that we want to see and make our climate and our environment as robust as possible. We now have Kirsty Howie, who's Executive Director of the Environment Centre Northern Territory, who has a few concluding words.
Hello all. I'm coming to you from the unceded lands and waters of the Larrakia people in Garramilla in so-called Darwin. And it's been an incredible evening tonight. We've heard from the Minister, and while there are real changes being proposed that could make a huge difference to the nature of Australia, far more is needed to achieve the demands that communities across Australia have called for tonight. So thank you so, so much for coming. Action on the environment in this country has always come from the grassroots, and that's where you come in. Conservation councils are the beating heart of the environment movement, connecting communities with decision makers via collaborative campaigns covering the length and breadth of Australia, and we've heard about those tonight. Your Conservation Council needs members, volunteers, and activists willing to get involved and take action for climate and biodiversity. So please, please, please sign up now to get involved in your Conservation Council today, to force our politicians to do more and to stand up for what really matters. Collectively, we can make the change that's needed. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsty. And thank you so much, Minister Plibersek. It has truly been excellent having you here with us this evening with our supporter base. People have joined us from right across the country whose interests, passions and concerns are diverse, nuanced and so important, we think, for you to hear. There's so much work to be done to protect and conserve our environment, and a long way to go to work to restore our environment to the most thriving extent that we can. Minister, we would like to ask you for a commitment for you to attend another online event such as this again in the future.
I'd be delighted. And can I thank everyone who's joined us tonight. I know it's it's a time away from other pressing things that you could be doing. I think the comment that environmental changes always come with grassroots support and pressure is absolutely right. And I do really respect people who put their time and energy into campaigning for the environment. Thank you for turning up.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you. I've said that a billion times already, for joining us this evening. We've heard from our Federal Minister for the Environment and Water, the Honourable Tanya Plibersek, and she's responded to such a diverse range of environmental concerns that our incredible supporter base has. From law reform to deforestation and land clearing to the Murray-Darling Basin, we have covered just a few of the pressing concerns our supporters have about the future of our environment and climate. Will our incredible savanna woodlands keep being cleared for fracking and cotton? Will the Murray-Darling Basin get the water it needs to thrive and to flow freely? And will we or won't we ever see a climate trigger inserted into the EPBC Act, first floated by our now Prime Minister in 2005? The overarching context for all of this, of course, is whether or not the actions we take will continue to dispossess First Nations communities whose culture, law and self-determination is at the absolute pointy end of environmental and climate justice, and to whom all of us owe an enormous debt. And with that, I formally close proceedings for this inaugural evening with the Minister. We cannot wait to keep working with you all. Take care and good night, everybody. Thank you.